They tried to hit me with a bogus fine, but I uncovered their scam. The result? The HOA was exposed, and its leaders are now under investigation. Alex Griffin had always considered his home the perfect place to live. He had chosen this neighborhood not just for its quiet charm, but because it allowed him to create a space that truly felt like home. Every morning he would step into his yard with a cup of coffee, admiring his neatly trimmed lawn, well-kept flower beds, and the trees he had planted right after moving in. Everything was in perfect order. But one morning, his peaceful routine was disrupted. Opening his mailbox, he immediately noticed a white envelope with the official HOA logo. Normally, these letters contained meeting reminders or newsletters, but something felt off this time. Tearing it open, he frowned as he read the contents. Violation Notice Number 4765. Homeowner, Alex Griffin. Address, 112 Oakwood Lane. Violation, failure to comply with landscaping standards. Fine, $5,000. Due date, 14 days. Failure to pay may result in additional penalties, including legal action and enforced collection. Alex reread the notice. $5,000? For what? His yard was always immaculate. In fact, many neighbors had even complimented him on how well he maintained it. He scanned the letter for further explanation. At the bottom, a note stated that proof of the violation could be requested from the HOA office. Without hesitation, he called the number listed. A bored-sounding voice confirmed that there were photos and offered to email them. Minutes later, his phone buzzed with an incoming email. Alex opened the images and froze in confusion. The photos showed an overgrown lawn, a leaning fence, and piles of construction debris. But it wasn't his yard. Mistakes happen, he thought. Maybe they mixed up addresses? But why send a fine before verifying? Shouldn't they issue a warning first? Either way, he wasn't going to pay for a violation he didn't commit. Alex grabbed his keys and headed straight to the HOA office. The HOA office was located in the center of the neighborhood, a plain, unwelcoming building. Inside, it was as generic as expected. A sterile receptionist's desk, rows of closed office doors, and the faint smell of cheap coffee. Approaching the desk, Alex firmly stated that he needed to discuss a wrongful fine. The receptionist, barely glancing up, replied, "Your case has been forwarded to management. You'll receive a response in due time." "I need an answer now," Alex said, keeping his voice steady but firm. With an exaggerated sigh, the receptionist picked up the phone. A minute later, a middle-aged woman with sharp features entered the lobby. Catherine Wells, HOA president. She sized Alex up with thinly veiled annoyance. "I received a violation notice for something I didn't do," Alex began. "The photos aren't even of my property." Catherine crossed her arms. "All violations are issued according to HOA regulations. If you received a fine, it means there was a valid reason." "But the photos show a completely different house," Alex countered. She shrugged. "Mistakes happen, but until your property is deemed compliant, the fine remains in effect. You can file a dispute, but reviews take several weeks." Alex felt his frustration boiling over. This wasn't just an error. They weren't even trying to fix it. They expected him to pay up no matter what. "You and I both know I didn't violate any rules," he said, locking eyes with her. Catherine smirked. "The HOA operates in the best interest of the community. If your property was flagged, there was a reason." Alex left the office fuming. On his way home, he started talking to his neighbors. At first, some were hesitant to speak, but a few opened up. Several families had already sold their homes after being buried in HOA fines. Others paid the fines just to avoid further trouble. One of the most revealing conversations was with Michael, an elderly man who lived across the street. A few years ago, he had received a fine for exterior home damage. Even though his house was in perfect condition, the HOA insisted that he make repairs. Then, conveniently, A recommended contractor, someone with HOA connections, showed up, offering to fix the non-existent issue for $10,000. "I had no choice," Michael admitted. "They threatened more fines and even a lawsuit." But the pattern was clear. Once homeowners were pressured into selling, their houses were purchased by people connected to the HOA. New owners, however, never seemed to get fined. They got preferential treatment, getting approval for changes others were denied. HOA wasn't just issuing fines, they were forcing people out, and if Alex didn't stop them, he could be next. Alex couldn't shake off what Michael and the other neighbors had told him. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a well-planned operation. The HOA wasn't simply enforcing neighborhood rules, they were running something bigger. He started with the obvious step, examining the history of fines. The HOA's website had public reports, but something about them seemed off. The number of violations was unusually high, and the fine amounts seemed excessive. Over the past 3 years, the HOA had collected hundreds of thousands of dollars in penalties. But where did that money go? Then he checked recent home sales. Scanning public property records, Alex noticed a disturbing pattern. Almost every house that was sold after a series of HOA fines ended up in the hands of the same small group of buyers. 3 names appeared most frequently: John Wells, Stephen Barkley, Lauren Fisher. The last name immediately caught his attention. John Wells, the same last name as Catherine Wells, the HOA president. Digging deeper, he found the connection. John was Catherine's brother. Stephen Barkley owned a construction company, the same company HOA recommended for homeowners needing to fix violations. Lauren Fisher ran a real estate agency that specialized in quick sales, offering lowball prices to homeowners in distress. The scheme was clear. HOA used bogus violations to bury homeowners in debt. Then, when they couldn't pay, they were pressured to sell fast. Their homes ended up in the hands of people connected to the HOA. Some were flipped for profit, while others were turned into high-rent properties. Alex knew that suspicions weren't enough. He needed hard evidence. He began reaching out to former homeowners who had mysteriously left the neighborhood. One of them was Carlos Rodriguez. His family had suddenly moved out months ago. After tracking down his number, Alex met him in a nearby town. Carlos confirmed his worst fears. For over a year, his family had been harassed with fines. First, a notice claimed their grass was out of compliance, even though it was perfectly maintained. Then, their fence height was suddenly declared incorrect. Next, their AC unit was too loud. The paint color of their shutters was violating aesthetic guidelines. Each fine grew bigger than the last. When the debt hit $20,000, they had no way out. When they tried to negotiate, the HOA refused. They had 2 choices: pay the full amount immediately or sell their home at a fair market price. Terrified of legal battles and more debt, Carlos had no choice but to sell, at half of what the house was worth. The buyer? A company owned by Lauren Fisher. Alex knew this wasn't an isolated case. HOA had been intentionally driving people out and recycling properties among their inner circle. Now, he needed documents that couldn't be ignored. The HOA was legally required to publish financial reports. Through an official request, Alex obtained spending records from the past 5 years. And what he found was worse than he imagined: thousands of dollars in community improvement payments, with no actual improvements made. Massive payments to Stephen Barkley's construction company, despite no visible work. Over $1 million spent on legal consulting, but the firms had no offices, no staff, no online presence. It was all a front. The HOA wasn't just scamming homeowners, they were embezzling money. Now, Alex had them. The HOA thought they were untouchable. But Alex was about to prove that no one was above the law. Alex knew exposing the scheme wasn't enough. The HOA would fight back. They had money, lawyers, and years of intimidation tactics. But now, he had the truth. First, he took the evidence to the press. He contacted a local newspaper, sharing documents, testimonies, and financial reports. The reporters were immediately interested and launched their own investigation. Next, he prepared for the legal fight. A friend connected him with Lisa Harper, an attorney who specialized in HOA corruption cases. After reviewing the evidence, she said, "This is a ticking time bomb. If we take this to court, your HOA will collapse." Lisa explained that their case wasn't just about overturned fines. It could lead to criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Together, they filed a lawsuit against the HOA, signed by 15 homeowners who had been targeted. The HOA struck back immediately. The next day, Alex received another fine. His penalty was now $10,000. Lisa laughed when she saw it. "They're panicking. That's a good sign." But things got more intense. That night, Alex noticed a suspicious car parked outside his home. When he stepped outside, it sped away. The next morning, someone had dumped trash on his lawn. Hours later, a new violation notice arrived, this time for unauthorized littering. But Alex wasn't intimidated. The HOA was desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. A week later, the newspaper published its front-page exposé. Neighborhood HOA caught in corruption scandal. The article detailed everything: fraudulent fines, illegal property takeovers, financial crimes. The fallout was immediate. TV crews arrived at Alex's house. City officials announced an investigation. State regulators demanded full financial records. Catherine Wells tried to respond. She gave a public statement, insisting the HOA was operating within the law, but reporters had already seen the evidence. No one believed her. The HOA was now under government scrutiny. A week later, city prosecutors launched an official inquiry. Lisa told Alex, "Now they have no escape." Residents who once stayed silent began coming forward with their own stories. People who feared retaliation were now speaking out. The HOA was no longer feared. They were seen for what they were: scammers who were finally being held accountable. But the real battle was still ahead. The court would decide the HOA's ultimate fate, and Alex was ready for the fight of his life. By the time the trial began, tensions in the neighborhood had reached their peak. For years, people had feared the HOA, but now they were standing together, ready to fight back. The HOA could no longer hide behind threats and fines. Their corruption was now public knowledge. The courtroom was packed. Residents, journalists, and city officials filled every seat. At the defendant's table sat Catherine Wells, the HOA president, alongside her team of lawyers. Gone was the arrogant woman who had dismissed Alex's concerns just weeks ago. Now, she looked nervous, a person who knew she was on the verge of losing everything. Alex sat with his attorney, Lisa Harper, ready to bring them down. Before them lay stacks of evidence: financial documents, transaction records, witness testimonies, and reports exposing fraudulent contracting schemes. This wasn't just a lawsuit. This was about justice. The first to take the stand was a city auditor who revealed that the HOA's financial records didn't add up. Funds collected from homeowners, fines, maintenance fees, and legal expenses had been rerouted to fake companies. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had vanished. Then came the witnesses. Carlos Rodriguez took the stand and told his story, how his family was forced to sell their home for pennies. His voice trembled with anger as he described the endless bogus violations, the escalating financial pressure, and how, in the end, they had no choice but to sell. Other homeowners followed, detailing a pattern of intimidation, forced sales, and preferential treatment for HOA insiders. As one testimony after another painted the same picture, the judge interrupted the HOA's lawyers. "There are too many coincidences here to dismiss this as procedural errors. I want to hear directly from Ms. Wells." All eyes turned to Catherine. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing at her lawyers for help. Her legal team tried to push back, claiming the accusations were false, that the HOA had acted within its rights. But the numbers told a different story. When it was Alex's turn, he calmly laid out a timeline showing that, in just 3 years, over 10 homes had been transferred to relatives and associates of the HOA board. "This was never about maintaining the neighborhood," Alex stated, turning to the judge. "These people created a system of financial coercion, using fines to drive homeowners into debt, forcing them to sell at unfair prices. Then, through shell companies, they acquired those properties for personal profit. If this isn't fraud, what is?" The courtroom fell silent. The judge studied the documents Alex had provided, then glanced at the HOA's lawyers. They looked defeated. They knew there was no way out. After hours of testimony and evidence review, the judge issued a landmark ruling. All HOA accounts were frozen pending a full audit. All fines issued in the last 3 years were declared illegal. Homeowners would be refunded their money. A criminal investigation into Catherine Wells and her associates was officially launched. As the judge finished reading the verdict, the courtroom erupted in applause. For the first time in years, the residents felt free. Catherine Wells sat motionless, her jaw clenched. She had lost everything. In the weeks that followed, Catherine Wells resigned in disgrace. Several board members were forced out. A new HOA board was elected, promising full reform. One morning, Alex stood on his porch, watching as workers removed the old HOA sign. The neighborhood was finally free. For years, people had lived in fear, believing they had no choice but to obey. But Alex had proven that even the most corrupt system can be taken down if you fight back, and he had won.